Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. This video is the final episode of the build of the famous Sopwith Camel Comic. The kit is from Eduard. It's a Profipack kit in 1:48 scale, and as we got used to it, the quality is just fantastic. Because it's a Profipack kit, there are pre-painted PE parts and masking sheet in the box next to the kit. We can choose from 6 marking options. In the previous videos you can see how I build the engine and the cockpit. If you want to check these videos, you can find a direct link on the screen or in the description below. This time I didn't use any upgrade sets, basically it was an out-of-the-box build. I thought about buying Eduard's upgrade kits for the Camel Comic, such as the engine or the machine guns, but in the end I decided that the original parts from the box would also give an acceptable result with some minor improvement. After I glued the 2 fuselage halves together, only a little bit of filling and sanding were required. In 1916, when the Sopwith Camel was born, aviation was only 13 years old after the first controlled engine-powered maiden flight of the Wright brothers on 17 December 1903. Brelio flew through the Le Mans Channel on 25 July 1909, only 7 years earlier. The technical development that took place in this short time is quite impressive. Throughout history, the desperation of wartime environments has led to enormous technical development. On the underside of the wing surface next to the struts, there are pre-drilled holes for the rigging cables. This is brilliant engineering from Eduard. These holes made the rigging much easier, but that's for later. Also, the control surfaces must be glued in place separately, which allows us to set them in an offset state, which makes the model more realistic and interesting. If we do like that, we should set the control stick in the cockpit in a matching position. I chose paint scheme A. I really liked the blue and white stripes pattern, but I knew it was quite a complex painting. I started the painting by cleaning the surface with isopropyl alcohol. Then I applied white primer. Primer is highly recommended when we know that we will use a lot of masking tape during the painting. A layer of primer creates a solid base for the paint, and the masking tape will not peel the paint off from the surface when we remove it. After the primer dried, I painted the whole surface with Tamiya Deck 10. For this project I used a lot of masking tape of various sizes. The canvas on the ribs looks lighter, or so it seems. This is nothing more than an optical illusion that can be imitated very well with a bit of paint. So I masked off all the ribs at the bottom of the wings with 1mm masking tape, then I overpainted them with a bit darker Deck 10. The Sopwith Camel was a British biplane fighter aircraft designed and developed by the Sopwith Aviation Company. Sopwith was famous for their Sopwith Pup and triplane, well-known fighters in World War I. The Camel was a single-seat, single-rotary engine design and was armed with 2 Vickers machine guns synchronized through the propeller. The aircraft was highly maneuverable, but because of it, it wasn't easy to fly, especially for inexperienced pilots. This unstable characteristic made it challenging to fly, but it was an advantage during relatively low speed and low altitude dogfights. The next step was the blue and the white stripes. I started with the white. I used Mr. Color's white paint. I like to use a bit thinner mix and build the desired tone layer by layer. After the white paint, I carefully masked the white areas and painted the blue. Mr. Color paints are quite resilient, so the masking tape peels off easily from the painted surface. There were 5 variants of the Camel. The main variant was designated as the F1, which was the base of all other subvariants. The 2F1 was the ship's camel, which operated from aircraft carriers. The Comic was the night fighter variant, and the TF-1 was the trench fighter, modified for attacks on heavily defended ground targets such as trenches. There were also two-seat variants that served as a trainer. I found only one original photo of this very Camel Comic. Contrary to the paint scheme A provided by Eduard, this photo clearly shows that only one white stripe runs on the side of the fuselage. The rest of the fuselage is blue, or probably blue. I'm sure that Eduard puts a lot of emphasis on designing accurate paint schemes, but here it seems different to me. It's also possible that the same aircraft was painted several times in different ways. All in all, it was more than 100 years ago, so we can't be 100% certain. And we should leave a little bit of room for our artistic freedom as well. The paint scheme description says that the area around the cockpit and the wing roots are red or black. Indeed, the only thing we can see in this original picture is that it is very dark and seems the same shade as the red surface of the rudder. So it was probably red or maybe black. I painted it red to make it a bit more colorful, but I left the sides of the fuselage unpainted plywood. As I mentioned before, I left a bit of room for my artistic freedom. So the paint job was done. Again, it was time to make post shading. I used the same techniques as on the underside of the wings. I masked all the ribs and overpainted them with highly diluted black paint. I was satisfied with the result, and it went much easier than I anticipated. The newly introduced German fighters, such as the Albatros D3, surpassed the English fighters in every respect. The Sopwith pup was no longer able to effectively compete with the Germans' faster and more firepowered Albatros. It was understood that they needed a new fighter. The new fighter would need to be faster and have a more powerful armament. The design effort to create this aircraft, officially known as the Sopwith F1. The chief designer was Herbert Smith. The prototype's maiden flight was on 22nd of December 1916, with the test pilot Harry Hawker behind the control. It was powered by the Clerget 9Z, a 110 horsepower rotary engine. During 1917, more than 1300 F1 variant Camels were produced, and by the end of the production, a total of around 5500 Camels were built for every variant. I didn't use the decals from the kit, not because there was something wrong with them. Eduard's decals are always excellent quality. I never ever had a single problem with them. I just masked and painted all the blue, the white and the red markings on the aircraft. I photocopied the decal sheet and cut my own masks with a sharp hobby blade. In this case, I could be 100% sure that the sky blue is the same shade all over the aircraft. The photocopied decals were also suitable for templates. I could use them to place the masking tape in the right place at the correct size. I painted Wooden Deck 10 as a base color under the wooden surfaces. Wooden Deck 10 is a perfect mid-tone base for wood imitation. On this surface, we can use mid or dark brown oil to create a wood texture. For the actual wood tone, I used Eptilum 502 Dark Rust Brown, as it is a bit of reddish tone, the same as what I look for. Then I overpainted it with a mixture of semi-gloss varnish with a drop of clear red paint. It changed the tone again to a bit more reddish or orangish color. The Camel had a conventional design for its time. It featured a wire-braced wooden box girder fuselage structure, an aluminum engine cowling, plywood panels surrounding the cockpit, and a fabric-covered fuselage, wings and tail. Although it shared certain similarities with the Pup, it had a more robust fuselage design. To simplify production, designers eliminated the dihedral on the one-piece upper wing and compensated by doubling the dihedral of the lower wings to 5 degrees. Ailerons were installed on both wings, so there were 4 in total, but their length was increased later on in production aircraft. The key to its distinctive performance was the concentration of weight and power within 7 feet of the forward fuselage. The engine, the cockpit with the pilot, and the fuel tank behind the pilot's seat were within 7 feet, a bit more than 2 meters. The wingspan of the Camel was 28 feet with 231 square feet of wing area. The ailerons had 36 square feet in total, which was more than 15% of the total wing area. I also messed and painted the cockades on the wings using my circular cutter from Eduard. This little inexpensive tool did a perfect job. This was the first time when British fighter aircraft was fitted with a pair of machine guns. The two 303 Vickers machine guns were mounted on the top of the fuselage behind the engine in front of the pilot. They were synchronized to fire through the propeller. The Camel version used Lewis machine guns on the top of the wing. Here is my trusty 0.3mm Sparmax Max Free airbrush. This is my go-to choice, it's basically good for everything. However, when I need some super fine delicate paintwork, I use my SP20X airbrush. It's a mid-price airbrush, but the quality is excellent. I made a review of it. If you are interested, click the link on the screen. According to the original picture, the white areas of the cockades were overpainted with green, blue or some darker paint. I chose dark green and I used my SP20X airbrush. The Camel was tested and later fitted with a more powerful and reliable AR1 rotary engine, which was later rechristened to BR1 as Bentley Rotary 1. It was around 150 horsepower and probably the best engine for the Camel. I used only a few decals from the kit. Here's the aircraft's registration number, B9287. Eduard's decals are fantastic quality. I had no problems with them at all. The Camel was known to be a difficult aircraft to fly. The aircraft's close placement of the engine, pilot, guns and fuel tank within the first 7 feet of the aircraft, which is around 90% of the total weight, made it highly maneuverable yet challenging to handle. Like any rotary engine-driven aircraft, the gyroscopic effect was quite strong on the Camel. Due to the torque of the rotary engine, it turned more slowly to the left than right. In addition, during a left turn, it had a nose-up attitude, but it turned quicker to the right than other fighters, although that resulted a tendency to drop the nose, a nose-down attitude from the turn. Because of the faster turning capability to the right, some pilots prefer to change heading to the left by turning 270 degrees to the right. During the cockpit build, I used a 1mm tube for the carburetor intake, but I decided to change it to a bigger 1.4mm one. To not drop the new tube into the fuselage, I used a long 1mm tube as a guide to place the new tube in the correct place. This bigger tube looks more realistic to me. For weathering, I like to use oil or enamel paints. I like to mix my own colors, my own tones. However, these uptiling oil paints are excellent colors. I did the weathering before I glued the two wings together. I had more room to do the weathering. The wings and the rigging didn't bother me. I used various colors such as rust, engine grease, different browns and greens, dust, and of course black and white to make the tones lighter or darker. At the end, I protected the surface with a layer of matte varnish. Upon entering service, the Camel gained an unfortunate reputation with pilots. Inexperienced ones who crashed on takeoff due to the full fuel load pushing the aircraft's center of gravity beyond the rearmost safe limit. When in level flight, the Camel was found to be tail-heavy. This meant that the pilot had to constantly apply forward pressure on the control stick to maintain level flight at low altitude. However, the aircraft could be rigged in such a way that at high altitudes it could be flown hands-off. A two-seat trainer version was later built to make flight training easier for the cadets. There were lots of accidents during takeoff with inexperienced trainees, so they relocated and reduced the size of the main fuel tank and placed dual control to help the training process. This version was a big help in mitigating previously unacceptable accidents during the training stage. Before I glued the wings, I prepared them for the rigging. Thanks to Eduard, there are pre-drilled holes for the rigging attach points next to the struts. I made small O-rings for the rigging cables. I wrapped 0.1mm copper wire around a 0.3mm drill bit. I made a lot. Then I glued them into these pre-drilled holes, fixed them with a small drop of superglue. While I was gluing these rings into the pre-drilled holes, I angled the rings to match the cable angles. Later, when I applied the elastic rigging to the ring, it was easier to set it in a more natural position. Now the wings are fully prepared for the final assembly. I used Y-cap Tamiya glue. It dries a bit slower, so it gives more time to position the parts correctly. In the beginning, I numbered all the struts to be sure I glued the right one to the right spot. This was the most challenging part of this build. You know, when a third hand would have been handy. Unfortunately, I don't have too much useful footage of the assembly. My hands were always in front of the camera or it was out of focus, but believe me, finally I could glue them together. For rigging I used Ushifande Rosten elastic rigging. All you need is sharp tweezers, ordinary superglue and lots of patience. But I mean lots of patience because it's a quite complex rigging. I planned the order of gluing the rigging wires. Installing them in the correct order is crucial when there are lots of cables involved. If we do it in the wrong order, we hinder ourselves. The correct order makes the process easier. As I mentioned earlier, I glued those little rings into the braided holes. It was much easier to apply all the cables using these rings. The biggest advantage is that the rigging slides in the ring. So after I glued it on one side, I thread the rigging through the ring on the other side. And I could stretch the rigging as I wanted before gluing. I believe it's easier than gluing the rigging into the hole or to the surface. I made the elevator cables for the last because they stick out from the fuselage. An interesting detail is that this aircraft's elevator cables are different from those of the other 5 planes that can be built from this kit. I'm not sure if this aircraft was modified or if this cabling was standard on other Camels. This little but spectacular detail was one of the reasons why I've chosen this aircraft. There was a streamlined wooden block for the center section bracing wires. I thought about how I could fit it precisely in the correct position. I drilled a 0.3 mm hole in the middle so that I could thread the rigging through it. I glued the rigging in one corner and threaded it through in an X shape. Since the rigging is flexible, I was able to set it in the desired position with a small paper template and fixed it with a tiny drop of superglue. After the long process of rigging, I finally could glue the undercarriage. I used Y-cap Tamiya glue to set the parts, and then I used superglue to strengthen the bond. A rotor hand pump is used to pressurize the main fuel tank. In early Camels it was fitted to the rear right fuselage strut, but later it was relocated to the undercarriage to reduce stress. A little propeller activated the pump to 1.5 to 2.5 psi pressure. Pilots preferred the strut location as they could see if it was working or not. P propeller was provided in the kit, and I upgraded it with a 0.3mm wire. There were two picketing rings under the wings. I made them from 0.2mm wire. I wrapped the thin copper wire around a 1mm tube. The result is a perfect circular shape. Eduard released an upgrade set for the Louis machine guns. I'm pretty sure they are more detailed than the parts from the kit, but I decided to upgrade the original guns. I drilled all the holes on them with 0.3 and 0.4mm drill bits. Not as good as the upgrade set ones, but they are a little bit better. The comic version was a night fighter. These aircraft had navigation lights on and under the wingtips. I didn't like the kit part, so I modified them with a 0.6mm alloy tube and added the electrical wire to them. I cut the pitot tubes off and glued 0.3mm alloy tubes as replacements. They look much better than the original plastic ones. And the final part is the engine with the propeller. There is a dedicated video for the engine build. If you want to watch it, click the link on the screen or in the description below. I realized that I hadn't painted the propeller when I had painted all the wooden parts. Never mind, I quickly painted it. This time I used desert yellow for the base color, and for the wood tone I used Art Spectrum dark brown oil paint. The aircraft that I built according to Eduard's instructions was produced by Bolton and Paul as a standard F1 in August 1917 under the serial number B9287. It was powered by a Clerget 9B rotary engine. A bit later it was converted to comic and entered the service with a 78 Squadron. It was painted in the light blue livery with white stripes. The top and the sides of the fuselage around the cockpit and the upper surface of the lower wing up to the third rib were a uniformly dark color, probably red, but it could be black either. The white parts of the cockades were also overpainted with darker tone, probably green. With this bright color scheme, the aircraft was most likely used for training flights. The combat aircraft were painted in dark green. Unfortunately, later the plane crashed during takeoff. The pilot, Lieutenant Taylor, was seriously injured and the aircraft was written off. The aircraft was done, but the build hadn't finished yet. I decided to create a small display under the Camel. I saw in some original black and white photos that the tail was supported so that the fuselage was almost horizontal. So I made this support and a little wooden workbench from styrene profiles. I used 0.5 and 2 mm square profiles. After gluing them and painting them white, I used various oil paints to give them a realistic wood tone. I also made a wooden toolbox and wheel chokes from styrene and painted them in different dark brown colors of oil. The Camel that I built is a Camel Comic. This version was a Night Fighter variant. The conception of the comic, the Night Fighter, was first tried in September 1917 when Captain F.W. Honnet, the leader of the 78th Squadron, had modified a Sopwith 1.5 strutter, relocated the controls to the back, the observer's position, and the synchronized Vickers gun was replaced with a Lewis gun on a Foster mount on the top of the wing. The modified strutters were unofficially called comics, but their night fighting performance wasn't sufficient, and at the beginning of 1918 they were replaced with Camels. These Camels were likewise modified with twin Lewis machine guns, and the pilot seat was moved back one frame to where the fuel tank would normally be. The fuel tank moved in front of the pilot. The move pilot position permitted to reload of the guns. These arrangements prevented the gun flash from blinding the pilot at night, as would the Vickers gun mounted directly in front of the pilot, and gave the pilot the option to angling the guns upward at up to 45 degrees. The upper wing cutout was enlarged to improve upward vision. The base was a simple 130 by 130 square. I glued the grass mat made by Nock on it, but it was too flat and too simple. I didn't really like the green tone of it either. So I added a few grass patches and painted the whole thing with various green and brown acrylic paints. Under the aircraft I weathered the area with engine grease oil to give it a realistic touch. I designed and printed a plug on sticky paper, which I applied to a 0.5mm styrene sheet and fixed on the face of the base with 2 copper nails. I also added a few tools from Aber, a bucket half full of water with a rig on the side, and even a fuel primer pump made from pipes and wires for the workbench. To imitate the soaked rig, I used acrylic gloss. This build took me 4 months, but I really enjoyed it. The Camel wasn't my last World War I aircraft for sure. Maybe next time I will make one of its famous rivals. The painting and rigging were definitely challenging, but the excellent Eduard engineering made this kit enjoyable. If you like this video or find it useful, please hit the like and subscribe button with a little bell, and you won't miss any of the upcoming videos. Your support means a lot to me and keeps my motivation high. Also feel free to share your opinions in the comment section. I hope you had a good time, keep modeling, and see you next time.